Hi, my name is Jenna Pilecki, and this is my EDU 455 final exam. In special education, it is very important to use person-first language when talking about an individual with a disability. At the end of the day, a person is a person, and their disability does not define who they are. An example of this would be a student with epilepsy rather than an epileptic student. Another example would be a man with a physical impairment rather than a physically impaired man. Person-first language allows those with disabilities to feel identified for the person they are, not just the disability that they have. Once again, their disability does not define them, and it is just a characteristic of their identity. Not every person who has a disability prefers person-first language. Some people prefer identity-first language, and two of those types of people are autistic people and deaf people. They believe that their disability is part of who they are, and they like to be identified with their identity rather than a person first. Another topic that is important to special education is criterion-related assessments and criterion reference assessments. Criterion-related assessments assess a student's progress in items that are similar to objectives or standards. So this means that these assessments are related back to others and not just the specific student, whereas criterion reference assessments assess a student's progress in a skill mastery against specific standards. So criterion reference assessments compare a person's knowledge or skills against a predetermined standard, learning goal, or performance level, or any other criterion. With criterion referenced assessments, each person's performance is compared directly to the standard without considering how other students perform on the test. Going back to criterion-related assessments, it compares how the student did on the assessment compared to all the other students in the classroom. Another topic in special education that is important are curriculum-based measurements and curriculum-based assessments. Curriculum-based measurements, or CBM, measures progress of a specific skill against an aim line. Some examples of this are like Dibbles or AimsWeb. These are online programs that allow teachers to measure a skill based on how the student is projected throughout the year, or their aim line. Curriculum-based assessment, or CBA, determines how a student is performing in or mastering the actual curriculum. So examples of this would be a chapter test or a quiz, but both of these types of curriculum-based measurement and curriculum-based assessment are both crucial to student academic success. The three-tier model of intervention, also known as response to intervention, or RTI, is an intervention system that can be used with all students to ultimately determine whether or not special education services are necessary. It is crucial to the development of students because it provides a foundation for assistance in the academic process. The significance of the three-tier model is that it consistently measures the progress of students. This progress is conducted by the use of assessments. An educator can utilize this model to address each student's needs in their relation to their peers' needs because it is used for all students. This model allows teachers to get a head start with student intervention instead of waiting for the student to suffer and struggle. The students can be classified into one of the three tiers of intervention based on the findings of the assessments that the teacher uses. The first tier is when the students are learning and performing tasks at or above grade level. These students are least likely to need intervention, which is why they are in the first tier. The second tier is when students are falling behind their peers. These students require targeted assistance to stay on their academic track. These students often show little progress on their own and require some form of intervention from their teacher. The third tier is when students are falling years behind their classmates. These students require intensive intervention in an effort to increase their progress and get the students as close to grade level as possible. All of these three tiers are important to education because it helps educators classify their students and know who needs more support and who seems to have a grasp on the content that they are teaching. One of the main components of special education is a 504 plan or an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. Both plans provide for accommodations, but a 504 plan and an IEP are different from each other. A 504 plan is for a child that has any disability. Section 504 covers a wide range of different struggles in school. In order to qualify for a 504 plan, their disability must interfere with the child's ability to learn in a general education classroom. An example of this could be diabetes, ADHD, or many, many others. These students require accommodations, supports, and services. On the other hand, an IEP is for students who have been diagnosed with one or more of the 13 disabilities that are listed in the IDEA. These are autism spectrum disorder, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, a hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, including blindness. This program also gives students accommodations, supports, and services, but it also has transition services for the student. To recap, an IEP provides for specialized instruction for students in grades K through 12, whereas a 504 plan can serve students at both the K through 12 and college levels. An IEP has measurable goals and objectives, whereas a 504 plan shows for accommodations for the student to help them succeed. Relating back to the last topic that I talked about, an IEP is an individualized education program. An individualized education program, or an IEP, is a written plan created by school staff and parents to describe the specific needs of a student with a disability at their current level and the objectives and procedures needed to adapt and support them so that they can grow as much as possible. The IEP team meets to discuss potential reasons for the student's lack of development and makes adjustments as necessary. Its goal is to provide support and services to the student. If the student does not receive the necessary progress, or if the student does not achieve the necessary progress, the IEP team reviews the situation and addresses how they can modify their plan to better help the student. An IEP is important because it is crucial to track a student's progress towards achieving their IEP goals and inform the parents of that achievement. The information gathered through progress monitoring is used to guide instructional choices and enable the IEP team to assess whether the student's IEP is effective. If a student is not progressing, the data collected from the IEP team allows them to modify the student's educational plan so that the student can still meet their annual goals. Special education means specifically designed instruction at no cost to the parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. But this would not be possible without Brown v. Board of Education, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Vocational Rehabilitation Act, Education for All Handicapped Children Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, No Child Left Behind, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and Every Student Succeeds Act. Brown v. Board of Education was passed in 1954, and this court case declared that it ended segregation in schools and that separate is not equal. There would not be special education without the civil rights movement because it allowed for people who have disabilities to stand up for what they believe in and then they can get the type of education that they deserve and are required. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the ESEA, was passed in 1965. This gave an equal opportunity for all students and addressed problems for students with disabilities and authorized state-run programs. This was very beneficial to student and special education students. The Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973 guaranteed rights of the handicapped. This prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies, the programs receiving federal financial assistance in federal employment, and in the employment practices of federal contractors. This allowed for people who have disabilities to have rights to an education. Education for all handicapped children was passed on November 29, 1975. The EHA guaranteed a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, the acronym, FAPE, to each child with a disability in every state and locality across the country. This declared that no matter what your disability is or what you need, you are guaranteed a free public education that will address the needs of you specifically and will help you succeed. The American with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was passed in 1990. This act prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in several areas, including employment, transportation, public accommodations, at the state and local government program services. No Child Left Behind was passed in 2002, or it is also known as NCLB. The NCLB was the main law for kindergarten through 12th grade general education in the United States. This law held schools accountable for how kids learned and achieved. The law was controversial in part because it penalized schools that didn't show improvement. This often led to schools not helping all of their students because they wanted to see the improvement, so they didn't document some students who were not improving. This act was active from 2002 all the way up until 2015, but it was replaced with Every Student Succeeds Act, or the ESSA. This was signed into law in 2015 and replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. The ESSA extended more flexibility to states in education and laid out expectations for parents and for communities. The ESSA required every state to measure performance in reading, math, and science. The ESSA offered new grants to districts serving low-income students, federal grants for textbooks, library books, funding, and scholarships for students who may need it. Another act that was important to the development of the special education program that we see today is the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or the IDEA. This law was passed in 2004, and it was the law that also made free, appropriate public education eligible to children with disabilities throughout the nation and ensures special education and related services to those children. There is a big difference between disproportionality and overrepresentation in special education. Overrepresentation can occur in classification, placement, and suspension, whereas disproportionality is the overrepresentation of minority students identified with a learning disability or any type of disability under IDEA. When a minority group's numbers in special education are statistically higher than they should be, they are considered disappropriate. An example of this would be if there are more African American students in special education than white students. This would be disappropriate because a minority group's numbers are higher than they should be in comparison to the numbers of a majority group. When schools have higher numbers of certain ethnic or minority students enrolled in special education that they should have by the standards or the statistics, it signals the possibility that some of the students may not truly be disabled and may have been incorrectly identified. There can also be an underrepresentation of minorities in gifted education. This goes hand in hand with disproportionality because it shows that a minority has more than the majority, whereas it should be evened out based on disability and the statistics. Disproportionality is a problem because it can prevent children from reaching their academic potential, fuel negative stereotypes regarding minority groups, result in a type of racial profiling, and lowered expectations among teachers, parents, and the students themselves. There is a process of how teachers can determine average performance on their students' assessments. This can be done by adding up all of the student scores and dividing it by the number of students who took the assessments. This will give the average for the assessment. For example, if you have 20 students who take the assessment and every single student gets a 100 except for one student who gets a 0, your average would be a 95. If you add all of the scores up together and divide by 20, you would get 95, and that would be the average performance on the student's assessment. There is a relationship between normal distribution of scores and standard deviation. Normal distribution will appear more symmetrical, and the more data there are in this. Normal distribution will appear more symmetrical the more data there are in the set. If the test results exhibit a positively skewed distribution, the test may have been excessively challenging or the students may not have mastered the material. On the other side, if the distribution of scores is negatively skewed, it may indicate that the test was too easy for the students and that they have mastered the material. A normal distribution is important to educators because it allows teachers to see where students are with the curriculum, along with what they are good at and what they are struggling with. It is important to have a standard deviation on either side of the mean that shows the students who did above and the students who did below. There is also a difference between validity and reliability, and both of these are important to assessing students with disability. Reliability and validity are both about how well a method measures something. Reliability refers to the consistency of a measure and whether the results can be reproduced under the same conditions. Validity refers to the accuracy of a measure, which is whether the results really do represent what they are supposed to measure. These are both important for assessing students with disabilities because it allows for more accurate results and information on what the students know and what they struggle with. Curriculum-based measurements, as I said before, measures the progress of a specific skill against an aim line. So some examples of these are Ames-Webb and Dibbles and the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement. These are all materials that the school provides teachers with. They can measure students' progress and give the teachers a better idea of how well their students are doing. A free website that teachers can use is EasyCBM. This is a website that I used recently, and it allows teachers to input their classroom roster, and they can assign their students with specific CBMs based on what they are learning about and what level of achievement that they are currently at. You can use this to find out how the student is progressing and if they need more support or if they need less support. Going back, curriculum-based measurement, or CBM, is a method that teachers use to find out how students are progressing in basic academic areas such as math, reading, writing, and spelling. Curriculum-based measurement is considered a formative type of evaluation that is used for progress monitoring. This is usually done every 2 weeks, and they are 1 to 2 minute long assessments. Another type of assessment is behavioral assessment. A behavioral assessment test is a psychological tool used to observe, describe, explain, and predict behavior. This is done to measure and calculate the various factors of behavior that measure a candidate's cognitive abilities. Behavioral assessments are now applied beyond the psychological study, and education settings use behavioral assessment to make decisions about their students and how well they are succeeding. So the purpose of this is to increase academic engaged time, the time when the student is actively involved in the learning process. There are many types of tools that teachers can use to assess behavior, such as an ABC chart, an FBA, or a PBIS. There is also direct and indirect observations to monitor and act upon the student behavior. My favorite one is an ABC chart because it measures when the student is doing it, what caused it, the behavior that it is, and then what the student did as an outcome or their consequence. There are a few legislative implications associated with a child's behavior in schools. There is positive behavioral intervention and supports and its relation to RTI. So PBIS is an evidence-based tiered framework for supporting students' behavior, academic, social, emotional, and mental health. This is similar to RTI because it has a 3-tiered framework. The bottom of the pyramid contains all the students, which is about 80% or more. It involves universal screening and supports for everyone. The second tier of students is when it becomes more individualized to the students. This has about 15% of students, and it involves targeted supports that can cater to the specific needs of a student. The last tier holds 1 to 5% of the students, and this is the intensive and individualized support tier. Most of the time, the students in this tier result in FBAs. Manifestation determination is a meeting where parents of a student with an IEP and school staff review relevant information about the child to answer 2 questions. The first question is, was the behavior caused by or have a direct and substantial relationship to the child's disability? And question number 2, was the behavior the direct result of the school's failure to implement the child's IEP? If the answer is yes to any of the questions, then the behavior is determined to be a manifestation of the child's disability. There is a hearing that is conducted to determine if a student's behavior is the result of a student's disability, and this must occur immediately before a student can be suspended for more than 10 days. An FBA is a functional behavioral assessment, which is a multi-component assessment to determine the purpose or function of targeted behaviors. This tries to answer the question of why the student is exhibiting these inappropriate behaviors. It defines the target behavior and comes up with a hypothesis about possible functions and ways that the student can remediate their actions. There are direct observation types that can be used when doing an FBA. One would be the event or the frequency recording. This is when someone would record how often the student is exhibiting this behavior. There is interval recording, which is for very brief periods of time where a teacher can record when the student has sampled the behavior. There is anecdotal recording, which is an observation of behavior in which the teacher notes all the behaviors and interactions that occur during a given period of time. Many teachers will have a notebook where they can write down the stuff that happens with their students so they can keep a good running record of it and can talk to their principals and their supervisors and higher ups about the issues going on so that they can document that they noticed these behaviors earlier than when it is being addressed. There is also a duration recording, which observes the length of a time that a behavior occurs. For example, if a student decides to have a tantrum on the floor and you notice that it is happening from 9 o'clock to 9:10, that is a 10-minute duration. There is also the latency recording, which is an observation involving the amount of time that elapses from the presentation of a stimulus until the response occurs. So say the student is having a temper tantrum again from 9 to 10 o'clock. What happened before that caused the student to have the tantrum, and how long it was in between the stimulus and when the student started having the tantrum at 9 o'clock. There is also inter-response time, which is the amount of time between target behaviors. It is important to come up with a behavioral intervention plan, or BIP. This allows the teacher to work with the student to come up with ways that the student can work on their behavior. Some examples that could be included in a behavioral intervention plan would be timeouts, there could be breaks, or there could be a chart that notes what a student is supposed to be doing at this time, and if they do all they're supposed to do, they could get marks that show that they did what they're supposed to do, and they could be working towards a reward. Overall, all of the modules in this course helped build a better understanding in my perception of developing an individualized education program, or an IEP. Knowing the history of the IEP allowed me to better understand the modern day IEP and how it has evolved from the first IEP until now. All of the modules in this course helped me in my understanding because it allowed me to learn the difference between an IEP and a 504, which if I did not know what the difference was, I would not understand how to do my IEP project. By knowing behavioral intervention plans, it allowed me to look at a case study and figure out how I can help the student in that situation grow and learn. Overall, I really enjoyed the class, and I think that having all of the modules and the work that we have done in class, including the legislative amendments and acts that were passed and other stuff, allowed me to get a better idea of where I am going down the special education path. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.